I wasn't going to let anyone in. That's the honest truth of it. After everything that happened with Renee, after the lawyers and the mediation and the custody arrangement that fell apart twice before it finally held, I had made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you announce to anyone. Just a quiet, private decision the way you'd close a window before a storm. I was done. I had Poppy, and Poppy had me, and that was enough. That was the whole of it. Poppy was 6 when her mother moved to Calgary, not for a job, not for family. For a man she'd met at a conference the previous October, a man whose name I still don't say out loud if I can help it. The courts gave me primary custody, which surprised me and didn't surprise me at the same time. Renee had never been the one who got up at 2 in the morning. She'd never been the one who learned which brand of applesauce Poppy would actually eat, versus which one she'd hold in her mouth and then slowly let drip onto the tray like she was making a philosophical point. I knew my daughter. That counted for something, apparently. So it was just us. A 2-bedroom apartment on Dundas Street West in Toronto, the kind of building where the elevator worked maybe 4 days out of 7, and the super was a man named Pete, who always smelled faintly of cigarettes, and was genuinely the most reliable person in the building anyway. I worked for a concrete and masonry company out of Etobicoke. Poured foundations, repaired retaining walls, showed up at 6 in the morning in weather that would make most people call in sick. It was honest work. My hands showed it. I was 38 years old, and my knees already talked to me in the mornings, and I didn't mind any of it because the work was straightforward and I understood what I was building. Poppy started grade 1 that September at a public school about 12 minutes from our apartment. She was shy, the way I had been shy at that age. Not broken, not troubled, just careful. She watched a room before she decided to enter it. Her teacher, a patient woman who sent home little notes written in green marker, told me at the first parent-teacher night that Poppy was bright and observant, and that she'd come around socially when she was ready, and I believed her, because that was exactly what my own mother had said about me 30 years earlier. The after-school program where I picked Poppy up every day was run out of the school gym, one of those city-subsidized things that kept the lights on until 5:30. It was there that I first noticed the boy. His name was Theo. I didn't know that yet. I only knew that he was always the last one sitting when the other kids were moving around, and not in the way that some kids sit because they're tired or because they'd rather read. He sat like he was waiting for something specific, contained, somehow, like he'd made an agreement with the noise of the room to simply coexist with it from a safe distance. I noticed him because Poppy noticed him first. She didn't talk to him. She just started sitting near him on the days when I was a few minutes late, which happened more than I'd like to admit because the traffic on the Gardiner in October is its own particular kind of purgatory. I'd come in to get her, and she'd be at a table, maybe 4 feet from this boy, both of them quiet, not playing together exactly, but not together either. The specific companionship of 2 people who understand that silence is sometimes its own kind of conversation. One Thursday I came in, and Poppy had apparently decided that this proximity arrangement was sufficient, and had moved to the chair directly beside him. They were both looking at a picture book. Poppy holding one side, the boy holding the other, neither of them speaking. I stood in the doorway for longer than I needed to. The program supervisor, a young woman named Bridget who wore her hair in the same high ponytail every single day, came over to me while I was signing Poppy out. "That's Theo Marchetti Caldwell," she said quietly. "He's been here since September. He doesn't really talk much to anyone." I said that was okay. His grandmother picks him up, usually, sometimes a driver. I didn't think much of it. Lots of kids are quiet. Lots of kids take their time. The next Tuesday, Poppy told me at dinner that Theo liked dogs. She said it the same way she'd say it was going to rain, like a fact she'd simply received from the world. I asked how she knew, since she'd told me before that he didn't really talk. She shrugged. He smiled when I showed him my drawing of Biscuit. Biscuit was her stuffed beagle. She'd had it since she was 18 months old, and it had lost an eye sometime around her 3rd birthday, and she'd named it herself, and I had never once suggested she might want a different one. So he smiled, I said. "Yeah," she said, "a real smile, not a polite one." I thought about that for a while. 6 years old, and she already knew the difference. I started paying more attention after that, not in a deliberate way, just the way you notice things when you're paying attention to something adjacent to them. Theo was always neat, his backpack zipped, his jacket on the correct hook. He had dark hair and these very serious eyes, and he moved carefully through the gym the way certain kids do when they've learned that their presence in a room requires management. I recognized that. I had been that kid. I knew what it cost. His grandmother came most days, a tall woman in her late 60s with silver hair, cut short, elegant without being showy, the kind of compose that comes from decades of practice. She and I nodded at each other the way parents and guardians nod in pickup lines across the country, acknowledging shared geography without requiring anything more. Then one Wednesday the grandmother wasn't there, the driver was, a man in his 50s in a black SUV who came in and said Theo's name like he was reading it off a list. Theo didn't move. The man said the name again, louder this time, like volume was the problem. Bridget was across the room dealing with a situation involving spilled apple juice and a crying kindergartner, and I was the closest adult, so I just crouched down to Theo's level. I didn't say his name. I didn't ask him if he was okay. I just looked at what he was looking at, which was a scratch on the gym floor in the approximate shape of a river, and I said, "That one goes all the way to the wall." He looked at me. I said, "If you were a bug, you'd follow it the whole way." He looked back at the scratch for a moment. Then he stood up and got his backpack. He walked past me toward the door, but right before he reached the man waiting there, he stopped. He turned back. He looked at me for a second with those serious eyes. Then he kept walking. I told Poppy about it on the way home, and she nodded like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. I didn't think about it again, or I tried not to. The woman's name was Isabelle Marchetti. I didn't know who she was when I first saw her. Why would I? She showed up one Friday in November, no driver, no grandmother, in a coat that probably cost more than my truck, and she looked around the gym with the very specific expression of someone who does not come here often but is trying very hard not to make that obvious. Theo saw her from across the room and went still in that particular way he had, and then walked to her with his backpack already on, like he'd been waiting for her even if she hadn't been the one he expected. She crouched down and said something to him quietly. He didn't respond. She smoothed his collar, which was already perfectly smooth, and then stood up and went to sign him out. I wouldn't have thought anything more about it, except that on the way out she walked past me and Poppy said, very clearly, "Your son is nice." The woman stopped. She looked at Poppy with an expression I couldn't quite read, not annoyed, something more complicated than that. "Thank you," she said, and then, carefully, like she was handling something she wasn't sure of, "What's your name?" "Poppy." "That's a beautiful name, Poppy." Poppy accepted this calmly. "Theo smiles at my dog picture," she said. "The one in my folder. He likes dogs." Something moved across the woman's face then, fast and then gone. "He does," she said quietly. "He really does." She looked up at me then, just briefly, the way you look at the parent of a child who has said something that lands somewhere you weren't expecting. I said something ordinary like, "She talks to everyone." I don't remember exactly. She nodded, said goodnight, and walked out. That was October. I didn't see her again until January. What I knew about Isabelle Marchetti, eventually, because Bridget told me, and also because Poppy's teacher mentioned it in the careful, neutral tone of someone providing relevant context. She was the founder of a development company called Caldwell Marchetti that built mixed-use residential projects across Ontario and had recently expanded into Alberta and British Columbia. Her late husband had been Stephen Caldwell, the Caldwell and Caldwell Marchetti. He'd died 4 years earlier from a cardiac event at 51, which was the kind of sentence that hits you differently once you've crossed your late 30s. She ran the company herself. She had an office in the financial district and a house in Rosedale, and she was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more successful people in the city. None of that was why I was thinking about her. I was thinking about the way something had moved across her face when Poppy said her son liked dogs. Theo turned 7 in November. Bridget mentioned it. I told Poppy, who made him a card, a drawing of a beagle with one eye and the words "Happy Birthday, Theo" in her careful, uneven printing. She put it in her folder to give to him. He didn't come to the program for the rest of that week. When he came back the following Monday, Poppy put the card on the table beside him. Without saying anything, he picked it up. He looked at it for a long time, longer than a kid usually looks at anything. Then he folded it very carefully along the original crease and put it in the front pocket of his backpack. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. Poppy seemed completely satisfied. I started noticing, in those weeks, that Isabelle came herself more often than the driver. She was always on her phone when she arrived, always ending a call as she came through the gym doors, and she moved through the room efficiently, the way someone moves when they treat every environment as a logistical problem to be solved. But she always slowed down when she got close to Theo. Always. Whatever she'd been managing in her head, she set it down when she reached him. I respected that. We started saying more than just goodnight. It happened gradually the way most things happen gradually. A comment about the weather, a question about the school calendar, the specific solidarity of parents standing in a gym at the end of a long week. She asked once how old Poppy was, and when I told her 6, she said Theo would be 7 in the spring. She'd apparently forgotten she'd said November, or I'd misheard, and that she paused, that he'd had a hard couple of years. I said something like, "Kids are tougher than they look." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode. "Sometimes," she said. I found out later, from things she told me slowly over time, that Theo had stopped talking about 6 months after his father died. Not entirely, not clinically mute, but functionally silent in most situations. Therapists, specialists, a communication program at Sick Kids, a private developmental pediatrician whose name I'd seen on billboards around the city. All of them had helped, she said, in the way that everything helps a little, and nothing fixes it. He talked to her quietly, at home sometimes. He talked to his grandmother. He had not, in 2 years, chosen to speak to another child. He had, apparently, started drawing dogs since Poppy's card. She told me that on a Thursday in January, in the parking lot outside the school, in -12 with the wind off the lake, making it feel like -20, both of us waiting while the kids finished getting their boots on inside. "He's drawing dogs," she said, and she laughed a little, which was the first time I'd heard her laugh. Everywhere, his notebooks, his homework, the margin of his spelling test. "Poppy will be devastated she started a trend without knowing it," I said. She laughed again. Then she went quiet for a moment, in the way that means something is being considered. She was the first kid he'd responded to in 2 years, she said, since Stephen died. I didn't say anything. I just stood there in the cold. "I don't know what she did," Isabelle said. "I've watched the staff try, the therapists try, I've tried." She stopped. She just sat next to him and showed him a picture of a one-eyed stuffed dog, and somehow that was it. What Poppy had said, a real smile, not a polite one. She wasn't trying to fix him, I said. She was just being with him. Isabelle looked at me. Not the way she usually looked at me in the gym, which was pleasant and brief, the glance of 2 people sharing a waiting room. This was different. This was the look of someone who had just heard something said plainly that they'd been trying to say to themselves for a long time without finding the words. "Yes," she said after a moment, "exactly that." The kids came out and we went our separate ways, but something had shifted. I felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before rain. Not romantic, not yet. Just the sense that a conversation had happened at a different level than the words. February was hard. Poppy had a week of fever that kept her home from school, and without her there, Theo apparently stopped sitting with anyone and went back to his corner table. Bridget texted me. She'd gotten my number for parent communication and had apparently decided we were on a texting basis, to say that Theo had asked, in his quiet, careful way, where Poppy was. It was the first question he'd asked anyone at the program in 8 months. I told Poppy when she was better, when the fever had broken and she was sitting up in bed, eating crackers and watching something on the iPad. She thought about it for a moment. "He talked?" she said. "He asked where you were." She nodded slowly, like this was important information that required proper consideration. "Okay," she said, "I'll go back Monday." She did. And when she came in, Theo was already at the table with the scratch on the floor, and he had a piece of paper in front of him with a drawing of a beagle on it. Lopsided, clearly labored over, one eye filled in with a dark scribble, one left blank. Poppy sat down next to him and studied it. "That's Biscuit," she said. He nodded. "You got the eye right," she said. He almost quite, but almost. I don't remember exactly when Isabelle and I started having actual conversations. the kind that go longer than the parking lot requires. March, maybe. There was a school fundraiser, one of those silent auction evenings at the school gymnasium, dressed up with tablecloths and string lights, and we both ended up near the same table of donated gift baskets and fell into talking the way you do when you're both at an event where you don't know many people and the wine is mediocre and it's easier to just keep talking than to navigate away. She was different outside the pickup routine. Not warmer exactly, but less managed. She asked about my work with genuine curiosity, not the polite, slightly tilted head curiosity of someone waiting to move on. She wanted to know what it was like to pour a foundation, specifically. What the process was, what you were thinking about, whether you could tell the difference later between a wall you'd done well and one you'd rushed. I said yes, always. She said she thought she could tell the same thing about buildings, walking into them, whether the people who built it had cared. I said I thought that was probably true about most things. We stayed at that table for 2 hours. Poppy fell asleep on a gym mat in the corner with 3 other kids, and Theo sat next to her reading a book about birds with a flashlight that Isabelle produced from her coat pocket, like she'd known this was going to happen. On the way home, Poppy said from the back seat, already half asleep, "I like Theo's mom." "Yeah," I said. "She has a good laugh," Poppy said, "like she means it." I didn't say anything, I just drove. There is a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. I had been alone for 2 years. I had been genuinely fine with it for most of that time. I'd built a life that worked, not a big life, not a complicated one, but one where Poppy was fed and loved and doing well in school, and the bills were paid, and on weekends we went to High Park or down to the waterfront or to the Science Center when I could swing the admission, and she'd hold my hand on the subway and ask me questions about how the trains knew where to go. I was not unhappy. But I'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with someone who was actually interested in what I thought. Not politely interested, actually interested. The kind of interested that means they remember what you said the previous week and ask a follow-up question. Isabelle remembered things. That was the detail I kept coming back to. In April, she asked me whether the foundation project in Scarborough I'd mentioned in February had wrapped up, and whether I'd thought it had gone well by my own measure. Nobody in my daily life asked me things like that. Not because they didn't care, but because the daily life I'd built was a practical one. It ran on logistics. It didn't ask much of me in the way of being seen. I told her the Scarborough job had gone well, that the foreman had let me do the finishing on the northeast corner, and I'd liked how it came out. She said, "You sound like you mean that." I said, "I do." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the parking lot in January. I didn't say anything else, but I think we both understood that something was being acknowledged, some mutual recognition that didn't need to be named yet to be real. It was a Saturday in late May when it happened. Isabelle had mentioned, a week or so earlier, that her mother was hosting a garden party at the family house in Forest Hill, a fundraiser for a hospital foundation, the kind of event where the parking alone required a valet. She mentioned it in the way people mention things that have nothing to do with you. Context, not invitation. Then her mother's hip went wrong 3 days before the party. Not a break, a strain, serious enough that walking the garden for 3 hours was impossible. Isabelle called me on a Friday evening. She'd asked for my number weeks earlier for school reasons, and said something I wasn't expecting. "I know this is strange," she said, "but Theo wants Poppy there," he asked. With words, full words, which she stopped. "He hasn't asked for things like that in a long time, and my family is going to be difficult, and I would rather not navigate it alone, and yes, I'm asking you to come to a fundraiser in Forest Hill with your daughter, who is 6, and I understand completely if you say no." I said yes before she finished. The party was everything I expected and nothing I was prepared for. A house that had been in her family for 40 years, Georgian brick, properly tended gardens, a catered spread that cost more per person than my monthly grocery bill. Her 2 brothers were there, both in finance, both with the kind of easy authority that comes from never having had to think very hard about money. Her mother was there in a chair on the patio, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, watching everything. I was wearing the nicest thing I owned, which was a blazer I'd bought for Poppy's school concert in October, and had dry-cleaned once since. Poppy had worn her yellow dress with the white buttons and had carefully packed Biscuit into her small backpack, and when she saw Theo across the garden, she walked over to him like he was just a person she knew, which he was, and sat down next to him in the grass and showed him the stuffed dog. He took it carefully. He examined the missing eye the way he'd examined it in Poppy's drawing all those months ago. Then he held it in his lap and said quietly to Poppy, "Does it bother her, the eye?" Poppy considered this seriously. She said, "She can still see everything she needs to." I was standing close enough to hear this. I don't know if Isabelle was, but I saw one of her brothers, the taller one, give me the slow, assessing look of someone's decided I am worth assessing, which meant I was being filed under a category, and I didn't particularly mind. I'd been filed under categories before. What I minded was, about an hour into the party, when that same brother found his way to me and said, with genuine pleasantness, like he was paying a compliment, "She needs someone who can keep up with her. Just saying that now." I said I understood what he was saying. He said, "She works 20-hour days sometimes. She's got a board to answer to. She has Theo." He looked across the garden at his sister, who was talking to a group of hospital trustees and managing it with the same focus she managed everything. "She doesn't have time for complications." 50. I looked at him. "I poured concrete for 12 hours yesterday," I said. "I'm not easily complicated." He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need him to. What happened next didn't happen to me, and it didn't happen to Isabelle. It happened between two kids in the grass at the edge of a garden in Forest Hill on a Saturday afternoon in late May. Theo stood up. He walked across the garden. He walked past his uncle, past his grandmother in her chair, past 3 hospital trustees, past a caterer carrying a tray of something that smelled like salmon. He walked to where I was standing, slightly apart from the main cluster of guests, in the way I always stood in rooms where I didn't entirely belong. He stopped in front of me. He held up Biscuit, and he said, "Poppy says you taught her how to take care of it." I crouched down. "I told her stuffed animals need the same thing as real ones," I said, "to be held and to know they're not lost." He looked at me with those serious eyes for a long moment. Then he reached out and took my hand. Not grabbed it, not clutched it, just took it the way you take the hand of someone you've decided to trust. He held it for maybe 10 seconds. Then he let go and walked back to Poppy and sat back down in the grass. The garden was not silent. The conversation around me hadn't stopped, but it felt to me very quiet for a moment. I looked up and Isabelle was standing 20 feet away, not with the trustees anymore. She was looking at me. Her face was completely open in a way I hadn't seen it be before, not managed, not composed, just open, like something she'd been holding very carefully for a long time had just been set down. I didn't say anything, neither did she. But her mother, from her chair on the patio, had been watching. When I caught the old woman's eye, she gave me the smallest, most precise nod I have ever received from a stranger. We had dinner the following Thursday, just the 2 of us. Poppy was at my sister's, Theo was with the grandmother, and Isabelle picked a small Italian place on College Street that had 12 tables and no valet parking, which I noticed and didn't say anything about because I thought that was probably intentional and I appreciated it. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about Stephen. She brought him up from yourself carefully, the way you carry something fragile that you've decided is worth carrying, and about Renee, which I did the same way, and about the specific exhaustion of doing everything alone, and the specific satisfaction of it too, and about what Poppy had said to me once about Theo, that he just needed someone to sit with him without needing him to perform. Isabelle was quiet after that for a moment. Then she said, "That's what you did, that day in the gym with the scratch on the floor. You weren't trying to reach him, you were just there, present." I said I hadn't thought about it that way. She said, "I know, that's exactly why it worked." We walked back toward Spadina afterward. It was warm enough that it felt like summer had arrived early, the way it sometimes does in Toronto in June, and then vanishes again before you've finished appreciating it. She stopped at the corner, and we stood there for a moment, and she looked at me in that same way, direct considering, like she was deciding something she'd already decided. "I want to keep doing this," she said, "if you do." I said I did. She said, "It's going to be strange sometimes, for everyone." I said I understood strange. She almost smiled. You really do, don't you?" She did smile then, fully, the laugh when she means it smile that Poppy had named correctly the first time she saw it. And I thought, yeah, that's the whole of it. That's what it was always going to come down to. Not the distance between Forest Hill and Dundas Street West. Not her brothers or her board or my blazer from October. 2 kids in the grass and a one-eyed stuffed beagle and the decision to just be there without needing anything back. Who is the person in your own life who simply showed up? Who sat beside you without asking you to be different and changed everything just by being present? I'd be willing to bet you haven't told them what it meant. Maybe tonight's the night. I've thought a lot about that moment in the garden. Theo walking past everyone, past his uncles, past the trustees, past every person in that space who had more to offer by any conventional measure, and stopping in front of me. A 7-year-old kid who hadn't asked for anything from anyone in months, choosing, very quietly, to trust. I don't think that happened by accident. I think it happened because of a long chain of small, honest choices that none of us were making strategically. Popeye sitting next to him without needing him to perform. Me crouching down on a gym floor and looking at a scratch instead of at his face. Isabelle showing up herself, setting her phone down, smoothing a collar that was already smooth. None of it was calculated. All of it was real. 50. And I think children know the difference between those two things faster than most adults will ever admit. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who ended up mattering in Theo's life weren't the ones with the most resources or the best credentials. They were the ones who showed up without an agenda, who were honest enough not to pretend they could fix something they couldn't fix. There's a kind of integrity in that, in being willing to just be present without needing the moment to go a particular way. Poppy had it naturally, the way kids sometimes do before the world teaches them to manage themselves. I'd had to relearn it after Renee, after the apartment on Dundas, after 2 years of running a life on logistics and not much else. Isabelle had it too, underneath all the composure. That was what I recognized in the parking lot in January in the cold, when she said the words, she wasn't trying to fix him, and stopped herself. She already knew the answer. She just needed someone to say it plainly. And here's the thing about showing up with nothing to prove. It requires a specific kind of quiet courage that I think most people underestimate. It would have been easier for me to stay on my side of the pickup line, to keep things logistical, to drive home, to not crouch down next to a kid I didn't know and say something about a bug and a crack in the floor. It costs something to be genuinely present with another person, especially a person who is struggling. It takes steadiness, the willingness to not look away. Poppy had that steadiness at 6 years old, and I'd like to think I had something to do with it, though I suspect a lot of it was just hers. Theo found his words again, not because a program unlocked them, but because someone sat next to him and didn't need anything back. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that changes the direction of a life. I'm not telling you this because it ended well for me, though it did. I'm telling you because I think we all know someone like Theo, someone who went quiet, who pulled back, who the world decided was difficult or complicated or too much work. And most of the time, what they need isn't a solution. It's just someone willing to sit with them in the difficulty. To see them as they are, not as a problem to be managed. That's what I want to carry forward, not the garden in Forest Hill, not the part where things worked out. The part in the gym on a Thursday afternoon, when I looked at a scratch on the floor with a kid I didn't know, and chose not to need anything from him at all. That's where it started. That's where it always starts.